It was late November, the kind of night when the cold seeped through your jacket and wrapped itself around your bones. James Calloway adjusted his scarf as he stood on the near-empty platform of the Crescent station. The glow of flickering yellow lamps barely cut through the heavy fog rolling in from the fields beyond the tracks. He wasn't used to taking the train this late, but he had no choice tonight. His mother's health was failing, and he was determined to see her before it was too late. The station felt oddly deserted for a Friday night. A lone figure, an elderly man in a tattered coat, sat on a bench, mumbling to himself. James cast him a wary glance before checking his watch. The train was late. As the seconds ticked by, he tried to shake off the unease creeping into his mind. He chalked it up to stress and exhaustion. Finally, the train's whistle pierced the night, a mournful sound that sent a chill down James' spine. The train emerged from the fog, its black metal gleaming under the dim station lights. It looked older than James had expected, almost antique, with intricate ironwork adorning the windows and doors. As the train came to a stop, the old man on the bench suddenly grabbed James' sleeve. "Don't get on that train," the man rasped, his eyes wide with terror. "It's not meant for the living." James froze. "What are you talking about?" "The Farewell Express," the man whispered. "It takes the grieving and the lost, but once you're on, you'll never come back." James pulled his arm free. "You're mistaken," he said firmly. Though the man's words unsettled him, he stepped onto the train without looking back. The interior of the train was surprisingly warm and luxurious. Velvet seats, ornate brass fixtures, and a faint scent of lavender gave it an air of timeless elegance. James chose a seat by the window, the fog outside making it impossible to see anything beyond his reflection. The other passengers were an odd mix of people. A young mother clutching a photo frame, a man in a suit staring blankly at his hands, and an elderly woman whispering to a scarf she held as if it were a living thing. Their somber expressions made James feel like he'd walked into a funeral. The train jolted forward, and James noticed there was no conductor or staff in sight. As the wheels clattered on the tracks, the lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the passengers' faces. James tried to shake off the strange atmosphere by focusing on his phone, but there was no signal. The train's whistle echoed through the carriage, and James realized he was clutching his mother's letter in his hand. She had written to him just days before, her handwriting shaky but filled with love and regret. "I wish I could go back and do things differently," she had written. "I hope you'll forgive me." James' throat tightened as he thought about their strained relationship. His mother's struggles with addiction had cast a long shadow over his childhood, and though she'd been clean for years, the scars remained. He wanted to forgive her, but the pain ran deep. As he stared at the letter, the train's lights dimmed, and the carriage grew colder. James looked up to see the young mother standing in the aisle, her eyes wide with fear. "Where are we going?" she whispered. A sudden clang reverberated through the train, and a man in a long dark coat emerged from the shadows. He carried a lantern that cast a pale, flickering glow. His face was partially obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, but his voice was calm and chilling. "Welcome aboard the Farewell Express," he announced. "A journey for those burdened by the past. Please remain seated, and all will be revealed in time." The passengers exchanged uneasy glances, and James felt a surge of panic. "What is this?" he demanded, standing up. The conductor's gaze settled on him. "This is a place for unfinished business," he said. "You've all boarded for a reason. But not all of you will leave." The train lurched, and the carriage filled with whispers. James turned to see faint, ghostly figures appearing among the passengers. They were translucent, their faces filled with sorrow and longing. One of them reached for the young mother, who screamed and clutched her photo frame tighter. James' heart pounded as he saw a familiar face among the apparitions: his father, who had died when James was a teenager. His father's expression was one of regret, his mouth moving as if trying to speak, but no sound came out. "Dad," James whispered, his legs trembling. The apparition reached out, but before James could react, the train jolted again and the ghostly figure vanished. The passengers began to break down, each facing their own ghosts. The man in the suit sobbed uncontrollably as a child's voice echoed through the carriage. The elderly woman clutched her scarf tighter, whispering apologies to the air. James felt tears streaming down his face as memories of his father flooded back. The nights he'd spent waiting for him to come home, the promises he'd broken, and the sudden heart attack that had taken him away forever. Jones had never forgiven him for leaving, and now the weight of that anger crushed him. The conductor appeared beside him. "You carry a heavy burden, James," he said, "but the journey can only end if you choose to let it go." The train began to slow, and the fog outside parted to reveal a glowing station bathed in golden light. The conductor gestured toward the door. "This is your stop if you're ready." James hesitated, clutching his mother's letter. He looked around the carriage and saw the young mother stepping off the train, her face now calm and serene. The man in the suit followed, his shoulders no longer hunched with grief. James stood, his legs shaking. He turned to the conductor. "What happens if I stay?" The conductor's expression was unreadable. "You'll remain trapped by your past, forever circling the same tracks." James looked back at the seat where his father's apparition had appeared. With a deep breath, he stepped off the train, clutching his mother's letter as if it were a lifeline. As James stepped onto the platform, the golden light enveloped him, filling him with warmth. The train's whistle blew one last time, and when he turned, it was gone, swallowed by the fog. He felt a weight lift from his chest, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to forgive. He knew the journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to face it. The station dissolved into the familiar streets of his hometown. James pulled out his phone and dialed his mother's number. When she answered, her voice weak but filled with love, he whispered, "I'm coming home." Before moving on to the next story, if this is your first time, make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for the next stories. We need your support. Please share these stories with your friends and family. Thank you. As I sit down to write this, it's early July, but this story took place at the beginning of summer. Usually, I try to avoid going home during the break. I either stay in my college town or, if I'm lucky, travel to Europe. This summer, however, I had no choice but to return home. The thought filled me with unease, but I reassured myself that it would only be for a week. After that, I'd be on a plane to Germany. I wasn't in the mood to reconnect with my old friends or revisit familiar places. Still, staying cooped up at home wasn't an option either. To pass the time, I filled my days with solo activities, hiking, watching movies, or simply driving around aimlessly. By the last day, I was restless. The monotony was getting to me. I needed to do something different, something that would jolt me out of this boredom. That's when the idea hit me. Train hopping. Train hopping was one of the reckless activities I used to indulge in years ago. I'd given it up for good reason, but that day, the allure of nostalgia and thrill proved irresistible. I figured, why not? Just one last ride before I left. I drove to a secluded set of tracks I knew well, a place where freight trains regularly passed. The tracks were surrounded by dense trees and wild flora, which made them the perfect hideaway. The isolation was comforting. The last thing I needed was to get caught. I parked my car and walked to the tracks. The layout was burned into my memory. The tracks snaked through a wooded area before disappearing into a tunnel. On the other side of the tunnel was a small clearing, followed by a massive bridge spanning a river. Back in the day, my friends and I used to ride the train all the way across that bridge, but I was alone now, and the logistics were different. If I went all the way to the bridge, getting back to my car would mean a grueling 10-mile walk. Instead, I decided to hop on, ride through the tunnel, and hop off. A quick thrill, nothing more. I strolled along the tracks, scanning the area. It was early afternoon, probably around 2 or 3 p.m. After about 10 minutes, I felt the familiar hum of the rails beneath my feet. A train was coming. I stepped off the tracks and ducked into the bushes, waiting for the train to pass. Freight train conductors usually didn't care about trespassers, but I wasn't taking any chances as the train roared by. I watched the cars blur past me. I waited until a slower-moving car approached, then jogged alongside it. With a practiced grip, I grabbed hold of the ladder and hoisted myself up. My heart raced as I settled onto the metal platform. The train wasn't moving fast, and everything felt eerily familiar until it didn't. Just as the train entered the tunnel, I saw a sudden flash of light up ahead. It was quick and disorienting, like a camera flash but brighter. My first thought was that it could be a spark from the train, though it didn't look like anything I'd seen before. I brushed off the thought, assuming it was nothing, and braced myself for the tunnel's darkness. The train picked up speed and the rush of adrenaline took over. Then, out of nowhere, I felt a hand grab my leg. Panic surged through me. I lost my footing but managed to cling tightly to the ladder. I screamed and kicked blindly, trying to shake off whatever had grabbed me. The train sped through the tunnel, and for a moment I thought it was over. But then I felt it again, another hand slapped against my leg. This time, I scrambled higher up the ladder, desperately trying to get out of reach. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it would burst out of my chest. When the train emerged from the tunnel, I didn't hesitate. I jumped off and landed on shaky legs. I watched the train disappear in the distance, crossing the massive bridge. My mind raced as I paced back and forth in the clearing. Who or what had grabbed me? Were there people inside the tunnel? And if so, what were they doing there? None of it made sense, and the more I thought about it, the more uneasy I became. A chilling realization struck me. The only way back to my car was through the tunnel. There was no way I was walking through that darkness with those people, creatures. Whatever they were, they'd see my silhouette against the dim light at the tunnel's entrance. My mind scrambled for alternatives, but there weren't any. Crossing the bridge was out of the question. It was too risky, and a train could come at any moment. Calling the police wasn't an option either. I'd be incriminating myself just by admitting I was here. Left with no choice, I picked up a rock for protection and steeled myself. Every step felt like a countdown to doom as I entered the tunnel. My eyes strained against the darkness, and my ears picked up every tiny sound. About halfway through, I heard it. A faint clicking noise. It was rhythmic, deliberate. It sounded like someone clicking their tongue, but it could have been a mechanical sound. Either way, it froze me in place. Stay back, or I'll shoot, I yelled, my voice echoing violently through the tunnel. The clicking stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. My bluff about having a gun felt thin, but I doubled down. I pulled out my phone, cranked up the volume, and played a YouTube video of gunshot sound effects. The sharp cracks reverberated off the tunnel walls, sounding far more convincing than I'd anticipated. I didn't wait for a response. Adrenaline took over, and I sprinted full speed through the tunnel. I expected hands to reach out at any moment, to drag me down into the darkness, but nothing came. By some miracle, I made it to the other side, unscathed. Gasping for breath, I turned to look back at the tunnel. That's when I saw it. Another flash of light illuminated the darkness, revealing two silhouettes standing on the tracks. They were motionless, facing me. My blood ran cold. I didn't stick around to find out what they wanted. As I turned to leave, a horrifying screech erupted from the tunnel. It was unmistakably human, but distorted, guttural, like nothing I'd ever heard before. I didn't look back. I ran until my legs felt like they'd give out and kept running until I reached my car. I've replayed that day in my mind countless times since. I have no idea who or what was in that tunnel, and I'm not sure I want to know. One thing's for sure, I'll never train hop again. The New York City subway system is a labyrinth of tunnels, echoing noises and flickering lights. I've worked as an MTA employee for 7 years now, and to be honest, not much surprises me anymore. Friends and family often ask me for scary stories, expecting tales of bizarre encounters or strange phenomena. Usually, I can't give them much to work with. It's mostly mundane, routine work, but there's one story, one experience that stands out like a scar. This happened about 2 years into my job, and it stayed with me like a shadow ever since. Even now, I can't explain what happened that night. At the time, I was stationed in Brooklyn, working at the High Street station. It was late, and I was performing some routine maintenance on the platform. If you've ever seen a subway station completely empty, you know how eerie it can feel. These spaces are usually filled with the chaotic energy of commuters, so seeing them deserted feels like stepping into a ghost town. That night, the station was utterly silent. The only sounds were the low hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional rumble of a passing train. I hadn't seen another person for hours. The loneliness didn't bother me much. I was used to it, but something about the silence felt heavier than usual. I was scrubbing down the platform when I suddenly heard a sharp clang echo from the tunnel. The noise was so unexpected that I jumped, dropping my mop. It wasn't a sound I could easily place, but if I had to describe it, I'd say it was like a rock hitting a metal rail. I froze, my heart pounding, and listened for any follow-up noises. When nothing came, I convinced myself it was probably a small animal or maybe a loose piece of debris falling. These stations are old, and strange sounds aren't exactly rare. Shrugging it off, I picked up my mop and got back to work, trying not to dwell on it. About 10 minutes later, the sound came again, only this time it was louder. Much louder. The metallic clang reverberated through the station, and I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't normal. My initial excuses about falling debris didn't make sense anymore. Feeling a mix of fear and curiosity, I put down my supplies and walked over to the edge of the platform. I peered into the tunnel, trying to see past the darkness. The blackness swallowed everything beyond a certain point, leaving me unsure of what I was looking for. My instincts told me to call out, but something stopped me. Instead, I stood there, straining my ears for any hint of movement. After a few tense moments, I decided it wasn't worth panicking over. Maybe it really was just some loose concrete, trying to shake off the unease. I returned to my work. Time dragged as I scrubbed, my ears hyper-attuned to every small sound. I was nearly done when a third noise broke through the quiet, but this wasn't the metallic clang I'd heard before. It was a voice, a child's voice. "Help me," the voice called, faint but clear. I froze, my blood turning cold. The voice sounded distressed, like the child was scared or in pain. Dropping my mop again, I ran to the platform edge and leaned forward. "Hello, are you okay?" I shouted, my voice echoing through the tunnel. There was no response at first, just an oppressive silence. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the voice called out again. "Help me." This time, it sounded closer. Every instinct in me screamed to leave it alone, to call someone else to handle it. But how could I ignore a child in danger? Against my better judgment, I descended the metal steps onto the tracks, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Where are you?" I called. My voice echoed back to me, but there was no immediate response. Then, after a long pause, the voice spoke again. "I'm right here. Just keep walking." The words sent a shiver through me. Something about them felt wrong. Still, I couldn't ignore the plea. I started walking, my boots crunching against the gravel. My flashlight flickered, barely illuminating the space ahead. "Are you hurt?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. Another pause, longer this time. "Just keep walking," the voice replied. That's when I noticed it. In the faint beam of my flashlight, I could make out the shadowy outline of a child further down the tunnel. Relief flooded me for a split second, but then I saw something else. Behind the child's shadow was another silhouette, taller, broader, unmistakably an adult. My breath caught in my throat. My legs felt like lead, but my instincts finally kicked in. Slowly, I started backing away, careful not to make any sudden movements. The child's voice called out again, more insistent this time. "Wait. Where are you going?" Ignoring the plea, I turned and hurried back toward the platform. My heart pounded as I scrambled up the steps and grabbed my radio. Once I was back in an area with cell service, I called the police and told them everything. Within minutes, officers swarmed the station, their flashlights piercing the darkness of the tunnel. They searched for hours, combing every inch of the area. Eventually, they found something that made my stomach churn. A single child's shoe lying on the tracks. It was small, worn, and out of place. The police speculated that there might have been a struggle, but without more evidence, they couldn't confirm anything. They promised to follow up if anything came to light, but to my knowledge, no leads ever surfaced. Whoever was in that tunnel had vanished, leaving only questions behind. To this day, I can't explain what I saw or heard that night. My best guess, someone a psycho maybe was using the child to lure unsuspecting people into the tunnel. But why? What was their endgame? Was the child complicit or just another victim? These questions haunt me, and I'm not sure I'll ever get answers. I still work for the Métis, but I'll never forget that night. Every time I'm in a quiet station, I find myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to hear that voice again. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that the subway isn't just a place for commuters. Sometimes it's a place where darkness lingers, waiting for someone to step too close.